The night I got the notification, I was in the middle of folding laundry. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment your life splits into before and after. It doesn't happen when you're standing somewhere dramatic. It doesn't happen at a kitchen table, with the right lighting and the right music. It happened to me at 11:15 on a Tuesday, in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver, with a pile of towels on my bed, and a true crime podcast playing through my phone speaker. 29 missed calls, all from the same area code. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and I didn't move for a long time. I need to go back, because if I don't explain what came before, the 29 calls don't make sense. Or maybe they make too much sense. Either way, you need to know where I started. I grew up in a small town outside of Sudbury, Ontario, not the city itself. The kind of place you drive through without noticing. The kind of place where everyone's last name sounds familiar, because half the town shares 3 of them. My mother's family had been there for generations. My grandmother still lived in the house where my mother was born. My uncle lived 2 streets over. My cousins went to the same school my mother had gone to. My mother died when I was 9, ovarian cancer. She was 34. After that, my father raised us, my brother and me, for about 2 years, and then he didn't. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There was no one morning where he packed a bag and drove off. It was more like he faded. He was there, then he was less there, then he was mostly gone in every way that mattered, even when he was sitting at the dinner table. Eventually, the sitting at the dinner table stopped too. So my grandmother stepped in, Gran Nettie. She was 61 at the time and she had bad knees and a sharp tongue, and she loved us in the way that people love things they didn't plan for but can't imagine giving up. She took us in without ceremony. She didn't announce it as a sacrifice. She just moved my brother into the room off the kitchen, and put me in the upstairs room that used to be my mother's, and that was that. I want to be honest about Gran Nettie, because I think she gets complicated in this story. She loved us. She genuinely did. But she also had grown up in a world where family meant something specific. Where you stayed close, where you contributed, where you didn't ask too much, and you didn't take too much, and you didn't leave. She had never once in her life lived more than 40 minutes from where she was born. I think she thought that was normal. I think she thought it was what everyone did. My brother Eli was 6 when our mother died. He was 8 when our father stopped showing up. He was soft in the way that middle children are soft. Or maybe that's not fair. Maybe he was just young and scared and I was 12 and acting like I wasn't. Either way, Eli folded into Gran Nettie's house like he'd always been there. He made friends. He joined the hockey team. He grew up knowing every family at the rink by name. I was different, not difficult. I want to be careful about that word, because I heard it a lot and I don't think it was accurate. I was just somewhere else in my head. I read. I did well in school. I started writing for the school paper when I was 15. By 17, I was emailing local journalists to ask if I could shadow them. I was curious about the world in a way that felt enormous and itchy, like something that didn't fit inside the town we lived in. My guidance counselor told me I should apply to journalism school. She gave me a list. Ryerson was on it. UBC was on it. King's College in Halifax was on it. She said I had a real shot. I didn't tell Gran Nettie right away. I told myself it was because I wanted to wait until I had something concrete to show her. But honestly, I think I already knew how the conversation was going to go. It went exactly how I expected. She didn't yell. Gran Nettie wasn't a yeller. She went quiet in a way that was worse than yelling. That specific quiet where you can feel someone reorganizing their feelings into something harder. She said Halifax was very far. She said Vancouver was very far. She said Toronto was very far. She said it in the same tone each time, like distance was the problem and proximity was the solution, and if I just understood that, I would agree with her. I said I had applied and been accepted to the journalism program at King's. I said they were offering me a partial scholarship. I said I had been researching work-study options, and I thought I could cover the rest. She said, "What about your brother?" Eli was 14 at the time, healthy, enrolled in school, surrounded by friends, living with our grandmother who had been raising him for 5 years. What about your brother was not a practical concern. It was a tether. It was the kind of sentence that's designed to make you feel that leaving is the same as abandoning. I said Eli would be fine. She said, "That's easy to say when you're the one leaving." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my mother's old room and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about what it meant that the person who had taken me in was now using that as a reason I couldn't go. I was 17 years old and I was already exhausted in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. My uncle found out 2 weeks later. My uncle was my grandmother's son, my mother's brother, and he had opinions about everything and the volume to match. He came over for dinner on a Sunday, and Gran Nettie told him, probably not meaning to start anything, and he pushed back from the table and looked at me like I had said something personally insulting. He said, "Who do you think is going to help out around here?" I said, "I help out now." He said, "You're going to school on a scholarship and leaving your grandmother alone with a teenager, and that's your contribution?" I said, I'm 17. I'm supposed to go to school. He said a lot of things after that I was selfish, that I was ungrateful, that my mother would have wanted me to stay close to family. I sat there and I took it because I was 17, and he was an adult, and I didn't know yet that I was allowed to stand up. Later, washing dishes, Nettie patted my arm and said he means well. That was the closest she got to apologizing for him. I went to Halifax in September. The first year was hard in the way that first years are hard. Lonely, expensive, disorienting. I was living in residence with people who seemed to already know how to be adults. And I was figuring it out at the same speed as everyone else, but trying to hide that I was figuring it out. I called Nettie every Sunday. She asked about the weather. She asked about Eli, as though I would know more than she did. She didn't ask about my classes or my professors or what I was learning. I don't think she knew how to ask. I came home for Christmas that year. My uncle had a new complaint. I'd been spending my work-study earnings on textbooks and rent instead of sending money back. He said this in the kitchen, while I was making tea, like it was a reasonable thing to say to someone who was 19 and a full-time student in another province. I was so stunned I didn't answer for a full 15 seconds. Then I said, I'm in school. He said, you could help out. I said, with what? He said, Nettie's roof needs work. I want to be fair to myself here, and I also want to be honest. In that moment I felt something shift. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like clarity. The kind that comes when you finally see the shape of something that's been there all along. I was not a member of this family. I was a resource. I went back to Halifax in January and I did not come home the following Christmas. I said I had to work. It was partly true. I took extra shifts at the coffee shop near campus, and I put the money into a savings account and I told myself I was building something. By the time I graduated at 22, I had a journalism degree, a portfolio, 3 months of rent saved, and a job offer from a small digital publication in Vancouver. I called Nettie to tell her. She said Vancouver is very far. I said I know. She said, are you sure? I said I'm sure. She said she was proud of me. She said it quietly like it cost her something. I moved to Vancouver in July. I was 22 years old, and I knew exactly one person there. A classmate from King's who'd taken a job at the same publication, and I had never once in my life been west of Toronto, and I was terrified, and I was more alive than I had felt in years. The next 7 years happened the way good years do. Gradually, then all at once when you look back at them. I worked at the digital publication for 2 years, then moved to a larger outlet covering municipal politics. I wasn't famous. I wasn't a household name, but I was good. And I was getting better, and I had the kind of byline that showed up when people Googled certain stories. I won a small regional journalism award at 26. I got a raise at 27. I moved out of a shared apartment into a 1-bedroom of my own at 28, which felt enormous. I made friends. Real ones. A group of people I'd met through work and through a writing collective I'd joined. People who knew me as myself, and not as someone's granddaughter or niece or older sister. I had a relationship that lasted 3 years and ended without catastrophe. I got a cat, a gray one named after a street in my neighborhood. I started running. I signed up for a half marathon and didn't finish the training but started the race anyway and completed it, which I count as a success. I called Nettie, less and less. It wasn't a decision, exactly. More like a natural settling. The calls had always been brief and surface level. And I was building a life that had no natural entry point for her. She didn't have email. She didn't understand what I did for work. When I told her I'd published a piece that was getting national attention, she said, "That's nice," and asked if I was eating enough vegetables. My uncle stopped calling after a while. There had been a few more financial conversations over the years. Could I help with Eli's car repairs? Could I contribute to a new furnace? Could I chip in for Nettie's mobility aids? And each time I'd either deflected or sent something small, and resented it immediately after. I knew, logically, that I was not responsible for the household infrastructure of a family I barely spoke to. I also felt guilty in a way I hadn't yet figured out how to put down. The last call from my uncle, before the 29, was about 3 years ago. He wanted $5,000. He had a reason. A cousin needed legal help, some kind of impaired driving situation, and he presented it the way he presented everything, as a thing that obviously I would do because that was what family did. I said no. He said I had always been selfish. He said my mother would be ashamed. I said, don't do that. He said he was just being honest. I said, I think we should stop talking for a while. He said fine. I blocked his number. And then, after sitting with it for a week, I blocked my cousin's number, and my aunt's number, and I called Nettie, and told her I loved her. But I needed some space, and she said she didn't understand, and I said, I know, and I said goodbye. I didn't call again. She didn't call either, or if she did, I didn't see it. I'd set her number to go straight to voicemail without ringing. I told myself I would check those voicemails eventually. I didn't. I want to say that I felt free after that. And I did, mostly. But there was also something underneath the freedom that I didn't like looking at, something that felt like standing in a room, where a piece of furniture has been removed. And you keep almost bumping into the empty space where it used to be. I published a piece in February that changed things. It was an investigative feature. I'd been working on it for 8 months. A story about a housing contractor in the Lower Mainland who had been systematically overcharging seniors for repairs. It ran in a major national outlet. It got picked up. It got shared. My name was attached to it in a way that it hadn't been before, and for a few weeks I was the kind of briefly notable that journalists can sometimes be, where your inbox fills up with people you've never heard of, and a few people you used to know. One of those people was Eli. He sent me a LinkedIn message. I don't know how else he would have found me. I hadn't shared my professional contact information with anyone in Sudbury for years. But he found the piece, and he found my profile, and he sent a message at 11:42 on a Thursday night that said, "Saw's your article. It's good. I've been thinking about you." I stared at that message for a long time. Eli and I had not been close. Not since he was a teenager. By the time I left for Halifax, he was 14, and we were more like two people sharing a grandmother than like siblings. After I graduated and moved to Vancouver, we'd exchanged maybe a dozen texts over 7 years, mostly on birthdays, and even those had trailed off. He wasn't malicious. He just existed in a world that didn't overlap with mine. I didn't respond to the LinkedIn message. 2 days later, my phone started ringing. The first call was from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't pick up. The second was from a different number I didn't recognize. I didn't pick up. By the end of that first day, there were 9 missed calls and 2 voicemails I hadn't listened to. By the end of the second day, there were 17. By the time I sat down on my bed with the laundry and the podcast and finally looked at my phone, there were 29 missed calls and 14 text messages across 4 different numbers, and the texts all said variations of the same thing. "Call us back. We need to talk. It's important, please." Gran Nettie, one of the texts said, from a number I didn't recognize, but the message identified itself. Gran Nettie isn't doing well. I put the phone face down on the mattress. I picked it up again. I put it back down. I went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and drank all of it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the alley behind my building. My neighbor's light was on in the apartment across the way. A raccoon was investigating the recycling bins below. I thought about the furnace. I thought about the $5,000. I thought about my uncle's voice saying my mother would be ashamed. I thought about the Sunday calls where Gran Nettie asked about the weather. I thought about the room upstairs. My mother's room, the way it smelled like old wood, and the lavender sachets Gran Nettie put in every drawer. I had lain in that room on the worst nights of my adolescence, and the ceiling had held all of it. The grief and the confusion, and the particular loneliness of being smart in a place that didn't have space for it. And I had looked up at it, and thought, someday I'm going to live somewhere else. I went back to the bedroom and I picked up the phone and I opened the voicemails. The first one was my uncle. He sounded nothing like himself, which stopped me before I could brace against it. His voice was flat and a little ragged, and he said, "Your grandmother had a stroke last week. She's in hospital in Sudbury. She's okay, she's stable, but she's going to need care after this, and we need to figure out what that looks like. Please call me back." I sat with that for a minute. The second voicemail was from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, someone who identified herself as a cousin I barely remembered, who said essentially the same thing, and added that Gran Nettie had been asking for me. The third voicemail was from Eli. He sounded like he was calling from somewhere quiet, like he'd stepped outside to make the call. He said, "I know things have been weird. I know I'm not good at keeping in touch. I just thought you should know. I thought you'd want to know. I hope you're okay." I listened to that one twice. The fourth voicemail. The fifth. Different voices. Same message. A cascade of people reaching out through every channel they could find, because they'd found my byline and they needed something, and they had decided I was the person to provide it. And then there was one more. The last one. My uncle again, left late the second night, and his voice had changed again. Less flat, more strained, and underneath the strain something that sounded, genuinely, like fear. He said, "I know I haven't been fair to you. I know that. I'm not going to pretend I have. But your grandmother is 78 years old, and she has been asking for you every day, since she woke up in that hospital, and I don't know what else to say except please." I put the phone on the nightstand. I did not call back that night. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and I let myself feel everything I was feeling without trying to sort it into the right category. The grief was real. The love for Gran Nettie was real. The anger was real. The suspicion was real. The exhaustion of being wanted only when I was needed. That was real too. I called Eli back in the morning. Not my uncle. Not my cousins, Eli. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. I said, "Tell me how she is." He told me she'd had a mild stroke, left side, some weakness in her arm and leg. She was in the rehabilitation ward at the hospital in Sudbury. She was talking. She was alert. She was going to need physiotherapy and some modifications to her home and more consistent support than she currently had. She had said my name, he said. A few times. I said, is she in pain? He said, I don't think so. Not right now. She's frustrated. You know how she is. I did know how she was. I said, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. He said, okay. I said, is there a financial component to this? Is that why everyone's calling? There was a pause. He said, there might be conversations about that eventually. But that's not why I called. That's not why Granetti's asking for you. I believed him. I'm not sure why. Maybe because his voice had the same flatness as his LinkedIn message, an absence of performance, or maybe because I wanted to. I said, I need to think. He said, okay. I said, I'm not promising anything. He said, I know. I said, tell her. And then I stopped. Tell her what? Tell her I got her voicemails? Tell her I've been carrying the shape of her house in my chest for 7 years? Tell her that I left because I had to and I'm still not sure I forgive her for making me feel like leaving was wrong? I said, tell her I called. He said, I will. I didn't fly back to Sudbury. Not immediately. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to my therapist about it, a woman I'd been seeing for 3 years, who had heard the whole history, and who did not tell me what to do. Which was the right approach even when it was frustrating. I talked to my closest friend here in Vancouver, who had also heard the whole history, and who said, you're going to go, I can already tell. And I said, I don't know that, and she said, you've been packing in your head since you got the calls, and she wasn't wrong. I thought about what I wanted. Not what was right, not what was obligated, not what my uncle deserved or didn't deserve. What I actually wanted. I wanted to see Grannetti, that was it. That was the thing underneath all the other things. She was 78 years old, and she had taken me in when I had nowhere to go, and whatever had happened in the years between then and now, she had loved me in the way she knew how to love. I wanted to sit next to her bed and hold her hand. I wanted that, separately from everything else. I booked a flight. 1 week. I told myself 1 week, and I told Eli I was coming, and I did not tell my uncle until I was already on my way. The hospital smelled like every hospital. My uncle was in the waiting area when I arrived, and he stood up when he saw me, and I looked at him across that fluorescent lit room, and I felt 100 things and I didn't say any of them. I said hi, he said hi, he said thank you for coming. I nodded. I went in to see Grannetti. She was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was bigger. Maybe I had just grown into a version of myself that didn't fit inside the dimensions of my childhood memories. She was lying in the bed with her arm resting on a pillow and her hair down, which I had never seen before, not once in my entire life. And she looked up when I came in and she said my name. Just my name. That was it. I sat down next to her and I took her hand and I didn't say anything for a while because I was too busy not crying, which took most of my energy. She said, you came. I said, of course I came. She said, I wasn't sure you would. I said, I wasn't sure either. That was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in my family in years. The week was not a reconciliation in the clean sense. There were hard conversations. My uncle and I had one, 2 days in, that was uncomfortable and honest in ways I hadn't expected. He said some things I'd been waiting to hear for a long time, and he said them imperfectly, and I accepted them imperfectly, and we didn't hug at the end of it. But something shifted, not everything. Enough. Eli and I had coffee one morning before visiting hours and talked for 3 hours. He was 31 now and working as an electrician and had a partner and a dog and a kind of contentment that I hadn't experienced. He said he'd always known I needed to leave, even when he was 14 and didn't understand it. He said he'd been proud of me for a long time, but hadn't known how to say it without it feeling strange. I started crying in the Tim Hortons on Paris Street. He pretended not to notice, which was probably the kindest thing he could have done. Grannetti went home from the hospital on day 5. I spent my last 2 days at her house, the house I'd grown up in, helping her settle back in. I made her meals, and I helped her with her exercises, and I slept in my old room, my mother's old room, with the lavender sachet still in the drawer. The night before I flew back to Vancouver, I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about the last time I'd been in this room. Not the year I left for Halifax, but the last night before that, the night after the conversation with my uncle about my selfishness. I had lain there 17 years old and furious, and heartsick and certain that I was right, and certain that being right wasn't going to make any of this easier. And I had been correct on both counts. I didn't forgive everything. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story that wants to wrap up neatly, wants the stroke and the 29 calls to be the thing that dissolved all the old hurt, and it wasn't like that. The hurt is still there. My uncle's still has a long way to go. The dynamic between me and Grannetti is still complicated. She still doesn't entirely understand why I left, and I still don't entirely know how to explain it to someone for whom leaving was never an option. But I sat with her in her kitchen the last morning, drinking tea, and she asked me about my work. She asked what the story was about, the one that had gotten attention. I told her about the seniors being overcharged, the contractor, the months of documents and interviews. She listened to all of it. She said, Your mother used to say you were going to do something important. I said. She did? She said. She used to say, that one is going to figure out how the world works. She said it when you were 5. I didn't know that. I hadn't known that for 30 years. I flew back to Vancouver on a Sunday evening. I cried on the plane, which I don't usually do, and the person in the middle seat pretended not to notice, which was probably the kindest thing they could have done. I don't know what comes next. I'm still figuring that out, but I know that when my phone rings now, I look at it differently, and I know that whatever I decide, about how much contact, about how often, about what I'm willing to carry and what I'm not, I'm going to decide it because I chose it. Not because I was guilted into it, not because I owed something, not because a family is a thing you can't leave. I'm going to decide it because I know who I am now, in a way that 17-year-old girl in that Sudbury house didn't yet. She was right to leave, and I'm the proof. If someone who hurt you called after years of silence, truly called, not because they needed something, but because they finally understood what they'd lost, what would you need to hear before you picked up? I've been thinking about that question for months. I still don't have a clean answer, but I think the answer has something to do with the difference between someone saying, I'm sorry, and someone actually being different. The calls came. I answered some of them. I'm still deciding what that means.